It's time for True Hoops little Zoom from quarantine show. Bring it in. David Thorpe, how are you, sir? Welcome back.
I'm really good. I told Judy if a funeral of your dad is meant to energize you and bring you a ton of joy going forward to live a great life and honor your dad, this was one of the best weekends of my life. So extremely sad, but his suffering is over. My mom can put her life back together and fired up to talk about life going forward.
Chris Herring, are you there, sir?
I'm here.
Hey, how's it going, man? So we're delighted to be joined today by Chris Herring, who has written Blood in the Garden, the flagrant history of the 1990s New York Knicks. And now I think you're Spike Lee's best friend.
I don't know if I could say he's a best friend necessarily, but he and I have definitely become friends. But before I start, I wanted to say first to David, I'm really sorry about the passing of your father. I was going to say that anyway, and I know I just hopped in as you guys were talking about that, but I've been through that, and I know what that is. But I'm just so sorry for your family's loss.
Thank you very much,
Chris.
Absolutely.
You honestly like it's come up, but like both of your parents died not too long ago, right?
My dad in 2018 and my mom in 2008.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Jesus. And you now wait, catch me up. You live where now?
I live in Chicago, but I'm doing all my media stuff. So I've been in New York for the better part of the last week.
Yeah. Coke. Hey, we have a lot we want to talk about. Love your book. It's unbelievable. But just so we don't miss it, like the one thing that is a must for me is shunk, the credit card machine. Can you tell us that whole thing? For some reason, this detail has captured me.
It's one of my favorites too. You just want me to explain it more? Or?
Yes, please. Just start from the beginning. Why is this part of the story? What's going on?
No, I mean, he didn't tell me that. Chris Childs did. And I mean, he essentially, through that whole part of the book, I mentioned that the team just, wants to be close. And, they're a group of guys that get along together really well, even for teams that claim that this team was kind of a step beyond that. Well over half the team would participate in prayer sessions and everything like that. And the team had always gambled, but there'd always kind of been factions where, earlier in the book, I explained that, people sit in a certain part of the plane and, essentially the guys that are wealthier sit in one part of the plane and gamble together, basically Starks, Ewing, Oakley, maybe Mason as well. And then you've got the guys that read, and then you've got the guys that are like too broke by relative standards to really participate in those games with the guys that have more money. So Oakley deciding that he wants to be, an everyman and wants everyone else to be an everyman, decides that I'm tired of this rationale that people don't have enough money to gamble with us, or enough cash is probably the more accurate way to put it, to gamble with us. So he finds a solution and he gets a credit card machine and he introduces it to everyone and says, this is our way around that problem. Now you don't have an excuse.
What I love is it's not like the Square app at the farmer's market, right? It's like that.
No, it probably was viewed as that. Yeah, at the time it was probably viewed that way, but not anymore.
It's yesteryear. Jeff Goldblum says in the movie Jurassic Park, it's in the book too. Life finds a way, so he just found a way.
Right.
What is money making?
So and I saw funny. So everybody in New York was obsessed with this team. I was just telling David, it had a grip on the city. I moved to New York in '91 and lived through the 90s, and I was just I was an NBA fan, and I was blown away by this kind of boring style team was captivated the city, and you just see blue and orange everywhere. And I know people have asked you in a lot of interviews, why are you the guy writing the book about this? Because you were in Chicago, where I love this quote from you. I thought a Bulls parade was like a back to school parade.
Yes. I mean, completely. And how are you supposed to know anything different than that when that's where you live and that's what happened? And it's at the same time every year. It felt like, a holiday parade or something like that. But I didn't know who the Knicks were, didn't care. And to be completely honest, it wasn't like I was a diehard Bulls fan. I probably thought I was. But the reality was that, I was only 8 or 9 when by the time they won the 5th championship. So I wasn't of an age where I could really understand the dynamics of it. I was, everybody else liked the Bulls, so I guess I did too. And it really wasn't until really the very end of Michael's Bulls career that I really started to understand what it was. I certainly couldn't have told you why the team broke up. I was too young. And by that point, the Knicks and the Bulls were not playing each other in the playoffs every year anymore. So I didn't, I don't think I witnessed a single Bulls Knicks playoff, square off or anything like that. So I didn't have any animosity towards them. I would venture to say that I really didn't even have like a diehard Bulls loyalty. I was too young to really know what that was at that time.
So then you moved to New York eventually in adulthood and covered the Knicks and take this on as a reporter, basically, right? You're someone who's going to call every marketing manager and, how many people did you interview for this book?
I think it was 204.
Oh my goodness.
All told. Yeah. But exactly. And it's interesting because it wasn't my idea initially. It was my literary agent's, and he, when I said like I wasn't around for this and I wasn't of age to have known what this was, that was actually a plus for him, because he was like, well, based on what I've heard, you'll do enough digging and enough reporting to get up to speed with it, as opposed to just kind of assuming that you know it and not asking the question. So hopefully that was a benefit rather than, a negative. But yeah, I wasn't, so many people have these built-in assumptions about you're from Chicago, or, you didn't grow up a Knicks fan. You did grow up a Knicks fan. You took on this project because you're a Knicks fan. It's like, I'm pretty in the middle with all this stuff. I guess I was a Bulls fan, but even then, like, okay, when you replace Michael Jordan with high schoolers, who gives a damn, it's not, you're not passionate about that. So I wasn't like this diehard Bulls fan that just had to see them win all the time. It really wasn't like that for me.
And then the pandemic affected your reporting how?
A lot of stuff that probably would have been in person was done either through Zoom or over the phone. I mean, the good thing is you deal with a lot of people giving you the runaround, that all of a sudden can't really do that, because it's like, I know you're sitting at home too. So there was a lot of that, and the way I was approaching the book, it gave me a little bit more time, because everybody, well, I don't know that everybody, reporters probably don't do this, but I think people from the outside are like, did you talk to this person? Did you talk to this person? Did you talk to this person? When you start asking those sorts of questions, you're talking about the people that are the titular characters, the Ewings, the Starkses, the Rileys, the Van Gundys. You don't start there as a reporter. You can't start there, because what are you going to ask them that's actually penetrating? It's, you're going to be asking them base level questions as you try to warm them up and get to know them. And what I found the best way to do that is to, in my mind, you start with the people that are lower in the process, so that you can ask questions that they give you information about, and, that they've helped inform through questions that, stuff that only people that were parts of those practices and those experiences would know. So in my instance, asking someone like Jeff Van Gundy about the fact that he essentially would kind of babysit this secretary's son, a single mother who, at times, like anyone on their job, would get swamped. But because she's a single parent and really doesn't have the means to provide a babysitter for her son, she would basically bring her son to work on days where he was out of school or if he was sick. But in doing that, she's swamped with the 5-year-old, bugging her every 2.5 minutes. And so Jeff, very perceptive, would pick up on that when he would get free from practice or whatever else. And he would just kind of grab the guy and bring him to his office and, do puzzles with them, or, send someone to go get ice cream for the two of them, or what have you. Just a very sweet gesture, that introducing an anecdote to Jeff about the idea of, remember that brief in between moment where you weren't really a member of the coaching staff and you weren't quite a member of the front office. They were trying to find a role for you, but because of that, they brought in this big name marketing director who kind of ousted you from your office, and you got replaced, in your office. And Jeff Van Gundy, someone that would become integral to everything the Knicks did, essentially didn't have an office because they replaced him with someone from marketing. And, so laughing about that, you get in a little bit better, and you kind of warm people up a little bit more when you can show, look, I've done this stuff and I've done this legwork to get these details without even talking to you. And they're details that are something that you can smile and laugh at now. that, you know, it's just an easier way into a conversation than asking about how did it all fall apart. You know, it's not a natural way to do reporting. And I don't think most people recognize or appreciate that. You want to start at the bottom first with people that know those backstories and then work your way towards the top so that you can actually ask questions that matter to people at the top instead of just, you know, asking the same questions everyone else asks that frankly we already have answers for it based on seeing what those people have said in the past.
FBI style.
Exactly.
Well,
I mean, exactly.
When I hear you talking about that, Chris, I've written a book, but nothing like what you do. Is just my own memoirs, so to speak. So I don't know your business all that well. I tell Henry all the time, I'm really just a coach that writes a little bit. I'm not a journalist. But as someone who does deal with these players all the time, as men, not just as basketball players, I do listen to a lot of Hollywood podcasts where they go inside the journey of these actors and producers and directors, whatever. And we only, you know, we get to watch the movie. Well, every day, if they watch the TV show or the movie themselves, especially over the years, they remember, well, that's the day I got sick from the taco, and my son had to go home from school with a fever. That they have a life, and so we just see this tiny glimpse. And it's the same thing with athletes. Is the average fan, almost all the fans, only know those players as players on the court for 2 hours a night. And those of us that connect with them on a deeper level recognize they're the same as us. They just do something different for a career. And so I think that, and even just the little things I was reading, I haven't read it yet. Henry's sending me the book. I cannot wait to read it after these last few months that I've had. And the John Starks thing is so fantastic. Just his final bad game and what led to that. And as someone who does deal with these players, they do have trouble sleeping when they play badly. They ruminate on every mistake, and it's a game of mistakes. That's not a good thing, especially in the playoffs. So I think your approach and how you described what you do is a great study in the craft of your business. So as someone who enjoys learning about that, I thank you for that.
No, thank you. And yeah, this was a little bit, I mean, for me, it was different. You guys know my work a little bit. Even when we were in the process of trying to sell the book and pitch the book to the publishing houses, one person was extremely polite, where he said, you know, I'm very politely not going to bid on this book. Part of me is kicking myself because I know I'm going to be proven wrong here, but I'm such a fan of Chris's work, but I'm also a Knicks fan. So I've read all of his work in the past from when he covered the team for the Wall Street Journal. And Chris's writing style to this point, what he's known for is kind of having this quirky quality to his stories. He writes about how often Joel Embiid falls down. He writes
oh my God,
about,
I'm so glad you brought that up. I freaking love that story.
You've referenced, Henry's referenced that a few times.
I love that story.
Well, this person brought it up too, you know, brought up how many
Yeah.
times Kevin Durant's shoe has fallen off over the course of the season. So this person knew my work intimately, but basically said, you know, this book is a lot different than that. It's a narrative biography that just kind of has to tell the story of what happened with these teams and to these teams. And I fully believe that Chris is going to do that, but maybe I'm too set in the way he writes. So I'm going to be the first one to pick it up, but I don't want to bid on it. And it's funny because that was kind of and I took that personally moment where it's like, I don't want to be pigeonholed. Certainly not when I signed this book deal, I was 32 years old. I don't want to be pigeonholed forever as far as only being able to do that. But I will say, David, that it kind of having to ask questions around some of that stuff and learning about Starks in Game 6 and Game 7 and 94, it took me further into the player's psyche, or at least his psyche, than I'm used to being, because I'm normally not asking those sorts of questions. This project, I think, rounded me out a lot more as a writer and as a reporter. And I think certainly has given me confidence. When I wrote the first version of this book, I was not comfortable as far as like the way it read. And, so I rewrote it 3 or 4 times, essentially each chapter 3 or 4 times. And hopefully it reads that way now, that it's a lot more smooth and that everything kind of has a place and a purpose for why it's there, including player psyches and certainly coaches' psyches as it relates to Pat Riley.
Oh, there's so much coaching psyche in this book, man. It does feel like Pat Riley and then later Jeff Van Gundy's kind of obsessive tendencies are like kind of squashing or stepping on or pushing every character in the book one way or another. Does that seem fair?
Certainly Riley's, and I would say to some extent Jeff's as well. We have the anecdote in the part about Jeff where that really, really, really tumultuous 98-99 lockout season where they're dealing with a lot. I mean, frankly, they're probably as impacted by the lockout as anybody at that point, where they're an older team. Patrick Ewing had been the president of the players union.
Right.
And he, because of that, was behind a bargaining table at age 36 or whatever it was. So he's not able to work out every day at an age where he's going to, the metabolism is slowed down. He had the Achilles injury the year before in the playoffs. Or not that he'd had the Achilles injury before, he'd had the wrist injury the year before, where he missed most of the season and was never really going to get his touch back as a shooter because it was his right wrist. So he's got all that going on. The Knicks got Latrell Sprewell, who'd been away from the game for the better part of a year and a half, and just aging guys as well. And so they're really impacted by the lockout, not playing particularly well. They've got the highest payroll in the league. And I have an anecdote in the book about Jeff Van Gundy, how tightly wired he was and how tightly wound he was. And even when the team won games, that he was, not in the greatest mood on a plane if there were people having outbursts on the plane, loud outbursts. And so Dennis Scott, who is kind of like a happy-go-lucky guy that tries to break through the tension by telling a joke, was doing a little bit too much of that in Jeff Van Gundy's eyes on a flight back home in a game where they had a 5-point quarter against the Bulls, not the Jordan, Pippen, Rodman Bulls, but again, those teams that I started to fall out of love with the Bulls, that team, where they had a 5-point second quarter. They went into the fourth quarter, I believe, with 33 points. So Jeff was not in a very good mood when they lost that game by scoring, I think it was 66 points or something like that. But Dennis Scott is back there telling jokes. And so Jeff basically made a unilateral decision, did not run it by the general manager, did not ask for permission to do it. He unilaterally decided to cut Dennis Scott because he had done absolutely nothing in that game and was having a bad season to that point. And, the cherry on top was that Jeff does not put up with much in the way of outbursts on flights. So he was certainly a character from that standpoint in the way he wanted and needed things to be done. But I think Riley was at even a different level where, there's countless stories in there about him. But the one that
we were talking about the SUV color. Is this what you're going to say?
That is so crazy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that
tell us the whole story.
Idea,
what's the backstory? Is Dave?
So this is a guy, and the full backstory is this is a guy that needs things exactly the way he needs them. The team psychologist is not allowed to meet with players anymore, even though he has a previous relationship with them. Clyde Frazier and Marv Albert are no longer allowed to fly with the team because they're critical and they're not actual Knicks. Clyde Frazier's not a Knick. Keep that in mind. So that's the way Riley is thinking about this. The people that are scouts for the team need to provide advance. I guess not even provide. They need to ask for permission beforehand before they can come to practice. They can't just show up in Pat Riley's mind because they're not part of the team. So all that context, you have that. But then this is the one that got me, and this is the one that you probably heard, Henry. He then is overhearing Dave Checketts, the Knicks team president during those years, have a conversation with his wife. So Dave Checketts is speaking to his wife, Deborah. They're talking about the fact that Deborah is at a car dealership buying a car for the family at a Chevy dealership, and she's getting an SUV. She's getting a Chevy Suburban. She's just calling Dave Checketts to get his input on, do you really care what color I get, or does it not matter? So she's like, I was thinking forest green. How do you feel about that? Dave's like, that's fine. I think that's a good pick. Pat Riley can overhear her on the phone, and he says, Dave, are you kidding me? You can't get green. And Checketts looks at him and says, well, why? He said, green represents the Celtics, Dave. And obviously Riley had the arch rival, the arch nemesis Celtics during the 80s years and what have you. So Dave laughs for a minute, but then he realizes that Riley's not laughing. He's being completely serious. So then Dave tells his wife, okay, so never mind. Green's not going to work. And Deborah can hear this on the other end of the phone. And she's like, okay, how about
Why
red?
did you put me on speakerphone, Dave?
Right. So, she asked about the color red instead. Another fine choice. It's a standard color that a lot of people get. No. Dave's fine with it. Guess who isn't? Pat Riley says, that's even worse. That's the Bulls. And Shaq is, then just kind of relents at the point. And he's, don't bring home anything other than a blue one. It's got to be blue. And it sounds crazy. And it is, by the way.
It's crazy.
But, I used that, and I actually used it in an excerpt as well. That wasn't part of the same chapter, but I feel like you need to understand that aspect of it to better understand how it could have factored into mistakes that Pat made as the coach. Particularly, David was bringing up Starks and his struggles in 94. I do think that sort of in or out, loyal or disloyal thinking actually impacts the way Pat Riley makes at least thinks about one key thing that comes up in 94 that I do think maybe makes the difference between the Knicks winning a championship or not winning a championship. And it sounds silly, but I think a lot of time.
We have 40 minutes left. Let's really tell that story. Do you mind?
Please.
How did this go? There's you starting in John Stark's childhood. There's an event that sort of sets up his famous 2 for 18 bad shooting night.
Sure. So in his childhood, one thing I think people forget in that series is that, man, that game 7 from Starks was wild. It was horrible. How could anyone shoot that poorly? The Knicks had a practice run for how to handle John Starks earlier in the series. He shot 3 for 18 in game 1. Very rough period. His great uncle had just passed away super unexpectedly. John had bought 30 tickets for game 1 for his family from Tulsa to be able to make the 6 or 7 hour drive down to Houston. And as all that is coming together, his great uncle dies, one of the people that would have been at that game. And this is someone that I wouldn't quite say was a father figure to John, but was a really important male figure in John's life because he had no father that was present in the picture. So that all happens. But what happens within that is the fact that John, as a 6th grader, he had an instance where he was walking through the hallway, and keep in mind, this is Oklahoma in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I guess. He has an instance where he is walking through the hall and a classmate knocks his book out of his hands intentionally. John looks at him and says, pick it up. The kid says no and calls John the N-word. And John pummels the kid, I think understandably so, probably rightly so. In my mind, I'm a black man, so maybe I'm biased here.
I got your back on that one for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. That's an ally right there. So he gets in trouble though, because, in the principal's mind, and who knows whether there's maybe a bias on the other side of the ledger there, the principal says, well, John, you were the one that escalated it into something violent. So you're going to get suspended. The other kid gets off without anything. So John gets suspended. He's afraid to call his mother or his grandmother because he knows he's going to get punished in the form of a spanking, a whooping, whatever you want to call it. And the principal says, but you have to go home. You can't stay here for the rest of the day. This was early in the day, the school day. So John doesn't know how to get home. This is a new school for him, a new middle school. He only knows the school bus, how to get him home. And, situationally, John just makes a decision. Okay, I'll take the city bus, but he doesn't know how to use the city bus. He doesn't have much money to, make too many mistakes in terms of which route he takes on the city bus, but he's also too shy to tell the bus driver that he doesn't know where he's going, to ask for help. So he just takes the bus for a while and is going in the wrong direction, finally gets off the bus, uses the last of his money essentially to go the other direction, and still doesn't really know where he is once he goes back towards the direction that he lives in. Gets off the bus, just walks around for hours until he finds his way back home. Wouldn't ask anyone for help, felt like he could get out of the hole himself. But I think it informs the way that he played the game too. And there's also one other anecdote I share about Pat Riley taking the Knicks to gamble in Reno for 36 hours and Pat giving them all $500 worth of chips. And John being the first one to blow through his money completely, but deciding that isn't the way it's going to end for him, that he's got to get out of this rut and got to get out of this hole. So he digs into his own pockets for his own money and then gets on a wild hot streak, so much so to the point that the Knicks are ready to fly to Sacramento for their next game. They've got all their players on the bus, the other 12 players are on the bus ready to go to the airport. And the team trainer is taking attendance on the bus to make sure everyone's there. He realizes John isn't. So he runs back into the casino and he finds John at a craps table, like refusing to leave because he's on a hot streak. So this is the way the guy is wired, which then I think takes you to game 7 of that series.
Well, then he had a little extra at the end of Eastern Conference Finals. This thing happens with, well, Johnny, anyway, you tell it in your order, but
sure. So I'll go ahead and walk you through it. So that there is something that happens between all this. We all know that John Stark shoots 2 for 18 in game 7. I think the context you need to have before that is that, Riley trusts him at this point. Patrick Ewing is playing a horrible series offensively. He cannot score on Hakeem Olajuwon, at least not efficiently. I think he had either 4 or 5 games in that series where he shot worse than 40%. So John has effectively become their number 1 option, who, for the best teams in that league offensively, John is probably not even a number 2 option for those teams. He's probably already too important to this Knicks team. But in this series, he's literally their number 1 option, taking the most shots. He's averaging the most assists. He's shooting 50% from the field and 45% from the field in games 2 to 6. And he scored double digits in the fourth quarters of games 4, 5, and 6. So he's really important to this team offensively. And I guess, the information you need to have now is that he almost wins game 6 for the Knicks, which would have gotten them the title. They were up 3-2, 5.5 seconds left. He runs a pick and roll with Ewing, and Ewing sets the screen for him. It helps block off Vernon Maxwell, but Hakeem Olajuwon is the 2-time reigning Defensive Player of the Year. He makes an incredible play from, half a court away to basically get a fingernail on John's shot. John had made 6 shots in a row leading up to this one. He takes a 3 and thinks he's in the clear, but Olajuwon makes an incredible play to just get something on the ball, and the ball's trajectory changes. The clock expires and the Rockets escape by 2 to send the game to a game 7. So John, normally someone that can flush plays and just move right on to the next situation, he's traumatized by the way this game ends. The Knicks have 3 days in a row, 3 nights in a row that they've got to spend in Houston, kind of stewing over the way they lost this game and an opportunity to win the championship on the road, while the Rockets are sleeping at home and they're comfortable and they're amped. And, the city is behind them. The Knicks are sitting in a hotel room feeling like they can't even change the channel to anything because every channel is focused on the Rockets being back in the series. So John essentially suffers from insomnia 3 nights in a row. And then that leads into a game 7 where he's not focused. He can't play well. He's shooting horribly. He starts the game 1 for 13. And then the question is, like, are they going to pull Starks out? Because he's been so important the whole series. He's been so good the whole series. And to get to the point that I think Henry wants me to explain.
You do it at your face, but...
So, the guys on the bench for the Knicks at that point that you could realistically replace Starks with are Hubert Davis, who is young, maybe a second-year NBA player by that point, and someone that, frankly, everybody that I've talked to, including guys that love Hubert, say he didn't really feel ready for that moment. Like, Pat came down the bench at one point and looked at everybody, and Hubert looked terrified. That's kind of the way it's been explained to me. So, Hubert's not the guy, in Pat's mind, and everybody else kind of saw it too, that maybe he was a little bit too young. Doc Rivers had an ACL tear earlier the year, and they had not placed him on the playoff roster because of it. He would have been activated by that point in the playoffs in the postseason, but they weren't, they wouldn't have been able to use him till the conference finals. So Pat doesn't want to go into the playoffs 1 point guard short. So he leaves him off. So they're a little bit short in the rotation, which means that, Rolando Blackman is even maybe more of an option than he otherwise would have been. But the backstory here that had not really been out there until the book came out is that Rolando Blackman got into it with Pat Riley earlier in the postseason. The Knicks win a really, really emotional, euphoric game 7 against the Pacers. Patrick's got the putback dunk on a Starks miss to win game 7. Patrick, bounds onto the scorer's table to celebrate with his arms lifted. It was kind of like his hero moment.
New York just loses its mind at this point. Like New York, the city's just like, yeah.
Completely. So they win that game, an all-time moment for those Knicks players.
Bing bong.
And I saw that. They win that game, and they're none of these players have ever been to the finals. They've never won a championship. So they're in a great mood. And Rolando Blackman, as they kind of debrief and, they're talking about, making the trip to Indiana or to Houston. Rolando Blackman, a veteran, 4-time All-Star, at that point, the leading scorer in Mavericks history, asked Pat a pretty simple question. Like, Pat, this is a huge moment for us. Can our wives come along to Houston to celebrate this with us and be there with us? And Pat says no. It's a flat no. It's almost stunning how quickly he says no to someone that's that respected, who's that veteran and everything. So Rolando repeats his question and wants more of an explanation as to why not. And, he says, our wives have held down our households the whole season. It's been a really long season. It's been a really long playoffs that, the Knicks had played to that point 2-7 game series in a row against the Bulls, and that Hubert Davis call with Scottie Pippen in the one series before, and then the 7-game series against the Pacers, in which they fend off, a Reggie Miller 25-point fourth quarter with the whole Spike Lee thing that threatened to kind of throw that series into disarray for them. So Rolando pleads one more time, can we please bring our wives? I don't buy the idea that they're going to be a distraction. And again, keep in mind that story I told you before about how adamant Pat was about you're either in or out down to the color of your car, and supporting the way I think and what I do. And so when Rolando asks him a second time, at that point, it's disrespectful to Pat as far as the way he sees it. So he says no and leaves it at that. He immediately calls Dave Checketts, the team president, after all this happens. And he says, Dave, you might be hearing something about a little bit of a tiff I had with Rolando, but I need you to back me up here, that I don't think the wives should come along. Pat thought that even, he was so paranoid. He thought that the Laker girls, towards the end of his Lakers tenure, were a distraction to his players late in games. And he was trying to sell a columnist in the LA area, to write a column about how the Laker girls had been distracting, hoping that, a respected columnist writing that opinion would carry enough weight to get management to stop using them. So absolutely, he tried to do stuff and go around people and go directly to people when he felt like something was a distraction. I think the common thread here is he often thought that the women were a distraction somehow to his players. So anyway, he asked Dave Checketts, you got to back me up here. I don't think the wives should be there. And Checketts told me essentially, look, Pat was the guy who, he'd won the championships. I hadn't won before with Utah. None of the players had won before. And I had always told Pat I was not going to undermine him when it came to big decisions. And so I kind of felt like, he feels this is important. He was like, I will admit that I think as a coach, if you're as great a coach as, you say you are, and everybody says you are, wives being on a trip shouldn't make a difference. But okay, I'll let you have it for this one. I'll back you up on this one. But if the series goes 6 or 7 games and we end up back in Houston, I'm going to allow the wives to make a trip. I'm even going to charter a plane for them to come down. So they were there by the end of the series, but they were not there for games 1 and 2. But anyway, I say all that to say that Rolando Blackman, by the time you get to game 7, is not plugged in for Starks. I don't think he needed to play the whole fourth quarter or anything like that. What everybody has said to me is you could have at least given John a 2-3 minute breather just to calm down. The guy would not stop shooting at 1 for 13 in a spot where he clearly just needs a reset, a breather, a something, because he was shooting us out of the game. The Rockets admit that too. The other piece of context that matters here is that Rolando Blackman, for his career, he killed Houston over the course of his career. You look at his splits to this day, highest career shooting percentage, highest scoring average was against the Houston Rockets. Scott Brooks was a player off that bench in Houston, and he told me, he was like, we were petrified that Pat Riley was going to bring in Rolando Blackman because we never had an answer for the guy. And we were just kind of counting our blessings because John Starks was our best player in that game. That was what Scott Brooks told me. And he said, I feel horrible for saying it because I later would play with those Knicks too. And I got to know John, and I feel horrible that it played out that way, but I'm so grateful that it played out that way because it won us a championship in game 7.
And then Pat, I guess you reported in the book, sent Rolando a bunch of notes and messages through the year saying it was the biggest mistake of his career. And Rolando has never replied.
Yeah. Rolando kept trying to hint at the fact that he doesn't have anything against Pat. And I'm not here to deny that he, that's not true, but I think that says a lot. They've spoken, but he's never written back to those letters he essentially says, I've never talked to Pat about the game 7 stuff, because to him, I think, Rolando comes up short, never wins a championship. Neither do a lot of those Knicks players. And, I think the reason I included the Rolando detail, because to me personally, if you ask my personal opinion, I would say that even if Rolando's questioning of Pat impacted him not playing him for the series, which I think maybe it could have. Again, we're talking about Pat and all the stuff we know about Pat through the reporting I did in the book. I don't think game 7, Rolando also didn't come in and play game 1 where he shot 3 for 18. So to me, Pat had probably made the decision well before game 7 that Rolando wasn't playing. I don't think that the circumstances like that he would have otherwise played him had that not happened. I kind of feel like Rolando was more or less out of the rotation anyway. The reason I included it, despite me thinking that, is that all the players think that. Charles Oakley has a book coming out in another week or two. He mentions it in his book. Doc Rivers was the guy that kind of even put me on to the trail of that happening. A guy that, that was close with Derek Harper and Rolando Blackman. He's like, man, it's not my story to tell, but ask Rolando because there's something to that. And in my opinion, he still has a right to be angry and mad about that. Derek Harper has said the same thing, where he's like, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm not going to be the one to tell you, but ask Rolando. So several key guys from that roster feel like that was a reason that Rolando was held out. So to me, as a reporter, I have to stand out of the way and just let them speak their piece about the fact that they think that Riley had it in him to keep him out of a moment like that. So that was why I included it, regardless of what my thoughts are as a reporter. I was trying to be mostly a fly on the wall in this book. I didn't feel as if I was trying to offer up many opinions of my own. This was more like what the Knicks thought, what they felt, what their opponents felt, what the league felt, and what the coaching staff generally felt.
It makes me wonder two things. One is, did the Rockets' wives travel when they went to New York early in the series? I'm curious about that. And we've talked about this, Henry, on the show with Gerard, when Kareem asked Pat Riley when they were playing the Celtics, and Kareem had been playing very poorly.
Oh, right.
And I want to bring my dad on the bus. Yeah. And they had a rule, no one but the players were on the bus. And Pat Riley said to Kareem, who I know is not John Starks, but he said, okay. And Kareem brought his dad on the bus. And of course, they won a championship because Kareem just became this incredible player again. And so that, to me, I like that Pat Riley was able to fudge his rules because you're dealing with human beings, not machines and math. And yet in this case, later on, he wouldn't. Yeah, Judy's probably right. It's a different story because it's his dad, it's not a woman like a wife or a girlfriend. But
right.
Yeah, has Pat Riley ever opined about it publicly?
No, I tried to give him the opportunity to. I made such an effort to get Riley to me. I mean, and Henry, you know this from having read it. He's the central character in the book. My literary agent at one point asked, I love, by the way, I'm super biased here. I love the cover of the book. I think it's just,
and the title.
Thank you so much. Like that photo did not exist. It was kind of photoshopped in to have Riley and Starks.
Oh, really?
Three different photos that we pulled because there's never one photo of just the 4 key players from that era.
Look at that. You can kind of tell.
So good.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So we made a point, we struggled with that one for like 4 months because I looked through thousands and thousands of photos and there was never one. There was one really close one where we had Starks, Ewing, Oakley, Mason, and I think Doc was in the photo as well. But then Starks had like a mask on because he'd broken his nose. So it just wasn't perfect. It wasn't going to work. So we photoshopped a couple guys into that one. We used 3 different photos to make a composite basically. But anyway, my agent asked, are you sure you want Riley on the cover? And I said, are you what? Like, you read the manuscript and you're still asking me that question? Because to me, Riley is the central figure in the book. He's the most important person in the book. In part because, one, I start the book in 91. So he's the new person on the block, the new kid on the block. He's the catalyst for them turning stuff around. Him and Dave Checketts, I would argue, but mostly Riley. But then even when Riley leaves New York in super controversial faction, he becomes their arch enemy and is still a major part of the way they think, down to the fact that the Knicks are getting involved in trades just to try to thwart Pat Riley's plan to get Alonzo Mourning. Like they're trying to trade for Alonzo Mourning so that Pat doesn't get him and trying to trade key guys from their roster. Like I'm pretty sure it was Oakley and Charles Smith they offered. And at one point it was Mason and Starks to try to get Alonzo Mourning. And they're openly admitting to me on the phone, like, we wanted Alonzo, but we also really wanted to just screw over Pat Riley because we knew he really wanted him and was going to try to build everything around him. It's like when someone is driving your decision-making that much, when he's not even there anymore, that's your central character. And so to me, Riley was a massive, massive part of what they did, even in absence. Just down to the way he made the players feel, certainly down to the way that he made Van Gundy feel. And I would say, and I wouldn't flinch much while saying this, that was the most fiery rivalry of the late 90s. It's funny. I talked to Jackie McMullen, and the whole reason I wanted to interview her, I guess among other things, but this was the main reason, was that she's someone that covered, Lakers Celtics during those years.
Yeah.
She's written books on that, that matchup, that series, and the nature of that rivalry. I was curious for her take as to where does Heat Knicks stand up? Not necessarily. Obviously I know there probably aren't going to be 30 for 30s made on that, although you do have the one about the Knicks and the Pacers. But I would imagine for someone like you, Jackie, that's not one that even really registers. And she's like, I'll be honest, it doesn't, because there were never championships on the line. And I get that. So I understand there's a massive difference from that standpoint. But just as far as how much the teams hated each other, I don't think you have an equivalent in the late 90s for two teams that played against each other in the playoffs 4 years in a row. Every one of the 4 series went the distance. Every one of them went either 5 or 7 games, 5 games in the first round, which is, the maximum you could have. And you had a number of upsets where one team was better than the other, at least record-wise, or pretty clearly better than the other. You had a situation where a 1 seed lost to an 8. And you had fights and suspensions that marred 2 of the series because the teams hated each other so much. I mean, that famous fight between Alonzo Mourning and Larry Johnson, where Jeff Van Gundy goes sliding down Alonzo's leg like a fireman or something. In that fight, after that fight happened, during, I can't remember if it was right after or it was during the offseason, Pat Riley said the only thing he regretted about it happening was that Alonzo's punches didn't land. This is not language you hear in today's NBA.
This is Red Auerbach era stuff.
David Stern was furious, and he actually met with both of them one after the other during the offseason to say, you guys are going to tone this down, or I'm going to come down on you even harder in the future. And I mean, this was a team, the Knicks were a team that got plenty of punishment from the league as it related to these fights. It might have cost them a shot, maybe their last real good shot at a title. That first Heat fight between PJ Brown and Charlie Ward. So, I mean, this was just not, and I think it was Tim Hardaway that asked, I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, is it possible to hate a team more than, how much can you possibly hate a team? Because I hate the Knicks more than you could possibly, one of those things. These teams despised each other. And I don't think people can fully appreciate or understand that, maybe because they never reached, the Knicks did reach the finals, but the Heat didn't. Their matchups generally weren't to determine who was going to make the finals. But I don't know that you had 2 teams that disliked each other more than those 2 did in the late 90s.
I have a question, Chris. Henry, is it okay if I pick up on what you were saying? I heard you talking to Raja Bell, and you guys were all talking about how this was the Pat Riley personality, and I was really happy Raja, who's a Floridian that I once coached years ago from Miami Central High School at a 5-star camp. He said, well, he didn't say it this way. This is my way of saying what he was kind of talking about. He was Showtime. He adopted Magic Johnson's personality and all that offensive talent. And in Miami, talent in all 3 places is important, but there's an identity too. Miami was about speed on defense. They were the fastest defensive team when they moved Bosh to 5. And that's a pragmatic coach. You're supposed to do that. That's what Raja talked about. But I also heard you talk about this wasn't just team violence. You mentioned before games, he would show Rams butting heads and car crashes. He fostered a violent identity, but they were a very skilled, talented team. Do you think that had they toned that violent aspect down some, they still should have been a very good defensive team, absent that violent streak, and maybe adopted more of an offensive personality and identity? Might that team be good enough to beat a very good defensive guy like Olajuwon and the Rockets?
I think so. And, like I said, it wasn't my job to really inject my opinion in too many spots. But, I certainly came away wondering that, too, is that no matter how much messaging you use, which, the messaging was really intense from the videos he had them watch to the idea that that he was going to tell them literally to knock Michael Jordan to the floor in 1992 and different things like that. And, the intimidation factor, even if you take that out, okay, so if you put a lot of weight on how violent they were, they're still probably, I mean, they were the number 2 ranked defense in efficiency in 92. And then they were number 1 the next 3 years. It's not often you have a team that ranks number 1 in defense 3 years in a row. I mean, they still have to this day one of the most dominant defensive seasons. I think it was 93 that was the case, Riley's second year. So they still are probably no worse than like a top 5 defense, right? And I remember when you asked that question about like if you could have replaced one with the other just a little bit, does that make enough of a difference? I come back to a quote that I got from Phil Hubbard, who was a scout on one of those teams, one of the scouts that had to get permission to go to practice. And he essentially told me, I waited and waited and waited to have a weekend where I could get to practice, where I didn't have to be on the road for anything. And I go and I get permission from Riley, and I go and I'm so excited because, this is like a chance to watch a mastermind coach the team, to see how he operates, to see what drills he has him do. And you're sitting there for the first hour, and then the second hour, and then even a little bit of, 2.5 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes. And you're just waiting for Riley to get to an offensive drill that never happens. Like the team would just practice defense, and there was no offensive drill. There were no offensive drills at all in practice. And he said, it reached a point I wasn't necessarily bored, because you're watching Riley do different stuff to get more out of them defensively, but there were no offensive drills in these practices. And it kind of, you realize after a while, granted, this was a skilled team. They weren't very skilled offensively. I go to great lengths to explain that John Starks was really not a great passer, that Riley would stop practice over and over again to call out John and say, we're not going anywhere until John can make a proper entry pass to Patrick Ewing here into the post. So there were problems with that. But you wonder on some level, like there probably is like diminishing returns on on the idea of just keep going to the defense and pounding out the defense to try to get more out of it when you're really deficient on offense outside of Patrick and maybe John. And not to mention that I feel like Pat could have gotten a lot more out of Charles Smith too. Granted, he was a guy that certainly not Knicks fans' favorites. No. But he was the one guy on that roster, and I write about him at length as well. The one guy on that roster that kind of had a lot of skill on offense was a guy that had kind of a similar upbringing basketball-wise as someone like Anthony Davis, where he was undersized and kind of was a guard in high school and then shot up all of a sudden. And all of a sudden is, 6'9", 6'10", 6'11". And Pat basically decided on day one of practice with Charles Smith, I don't think this guy fits what I do here. And told people that. And later, I would make the argument, I think started to kind of challenge Charles physically to be more like the guys on that roster that were so tough, who played through every, nick and bruise that they had. But Charles had chronic knee problems. And Charles, was challenged one day before a game. Pat literally said to him, as Charles walked into the locker room in a suit, if you could give me 1 minute tonight in this game, and that 1 minute would be the difference between us winning a championship or not, could you give me that 1 minute, Charles? And Charles says, of course I would. Of course I could. And Pat says, then what the hell are you doing in that suit? He said this in front of the whole team. And it made it open season on the guy as far as the other teammates calling him out. Yeah. And he had chronic knee issues. Now I don't suspect that Pat knew that, but you were basically calling out the guy's toughness, and it just wore on him psychologically. Will Perdue, who played against the Bulls, obviously, or the Knicks during those years, obviously, and then would play with Charles in San Antonio, said by the time he got to San Antonio, there was nothing left as far as, certainly in his knees, but I think even psychologically, just Pat broke the guy down to tears, a lot of times based on what I was told. And so, I think Pat would have to coach certain things differently. And the idea that you're taking the team psychologist away from your players when you're speaking to them that way, you tell me. I think Pat is a brilliant coach, was a brilliant coach. There's no question, but there's stuff that really wouldn't have flown anywhere near today's NBA and the way that it was just okayed and maybe even glorified back then.
That story, actually, maybe Judy can join us while I just bring up, I'm going to read you, I don't want to read it, but Ewing feels a pop in his leg and doesn't tell anybody, oh, Gerard's in a new place. What's going on, Gerard?
I'm working. It's my
and he does exactly what Charles would have learned to do from that suit story, right? Which is basically like he feels a pop in his Achilles and he just gets it retaped, doesn't say anything to anyone until later in the game. Even then the team doctor's like, you're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah.
This ruins people's bodies.
Yeah. I mean, and Doc, was one of the best interviews I had for this book. I figured it'd be tougher to get a lot out of him because he's a coach now. He's probably the most public figure. I would say him and probably Jeff Van Gundy. And then obviously Patrick is coaching a major college program, so it's not to diminish him.
Right.
But I figured Doc would be a little bit more closed off as far as what he had to say. He's like, no, he told me what it was. He said he got traded from the Clippers with Charles Smith. He was working out with Magic Johnson and James Worthy when he got the call about the fact that he was going to be traded to the Knicks. And Magic told him right then and there, minutes after he got traded, your career, he's going to kill your career. You might win a title, so it might be worth it, but physically you're not going to have anything left. And, that's how hard he runs you. That's how hard he works you. There's not going to be really anything left of your body by that point. And if, you guys have been probably around Doc, I mean, you see it in his gait, the way he walks. And, Doc tore his ACL. Now I don't, it's not to put that on Riley. I think that could just happen. And Doc was someone that had been injury prone earlier in his career, but Riley wasn't making it easier on you. I've got the anecdote early in the book where Xavier McDaniel talks about a 3-hour shoot around that they had. And, Pat made these guys tape up for shoot arounds, the practices that you have the mornings of games, and that they later played a game that night, December 26, 1991 against the Spurs. And Xavier McDaniel basically told me, he's like, Chris, I almost overslept the game. I'd never done that in my career. We all had hundreds of shoot arounds by that point, but I almost overslept the game because we had a 3-hour shoot around. My body was spent. I was exhausted. I didn't even shower. I just plopped down into the hotel bed, and then we play and I have nothing. I can't even guard Sean Elliott and stop him from getting to the basket. And, he was more of a shooter than he was really a slasher, a driver. I played one of my worst games of the season. Then I yell at Pat in the locker room and I say, Pat, you got us playing 2 effing games out here today, one during the shoot around and then one for the actual game. How do you expect us to win? And so he's talking about being overused and being spent. And Pat actually responds by saying, like, you're not working hard enough. Everybody else comes in after practice and lifts. You haven't been lifting after the games. And so I'm fining you for that. I'm not fining you for the way you're reacting to me, but I'm going to fine you for the fact that you're not working hard enough for what I need. And it was part of the reason that the Knicks, initially had no interest or limited interest in bringing Xavier McDaniel back. Their opinions changed on that later when he had the performance that he did against the Bulls and intimidated the crap out of Scottie Pippen and beat Scottie up. But, there were moments where there were people in the front office that weren't really sold on Xavier, let alone the fact that he had knee issues as well that they picked up on early in that year that he spent with them. And the doctors were essentially saying, don't give him anything longer than a 1-year deal. Wow.
Hi, Gerard.
Hello, Henry.
You're beautifully lit.
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm in my studio. Chris, congrats on the book, first of all, and have not read it yet, but we'll be doing that. I'm loving the anecdotal stories about Riley. I mean, this is probably why the Heat are the way they are right now, right? With their insane body fat testing and and my thing I always worry about with them is that I love that they take every regular season game like it's the championship. But I'm always like, Kamei, I feel like you guys are running on fumes because you're grinding so hard. What was something in the people always ask you this, but I'm sure there's so many good ones. What's on the cutting room floor that you're like, that you fought really hard for, that they were like, dude, we just can't fit it in here?
I'll be really honest with you. There's not anything that they told me we can't make room for this. They were begging me to include more. With regards to words, I think the standard book like this can generally go up to 125,000 words. You can buy more space than that. And I think that normally puts you around 400 pages. My book was essentially, before we get to the epilogue and the notes where I'm explaining where I got all my information from, the book was basically 300. So I had a lot more room I could have used. I left some things on the cutting room floor and went through that stuff with my editor. And he immediately was like, okay, this has to go back in. This has to be in there. This has to be in there. Because they basically said, you've got more space here. You didn't use the full space that you could have. But also, this was the way they described it. So obviously, I won't say they're biased. They're also looking out, trying to make sure that I'm not, just putting fluff in there that people aren't going to like or that they're not going to read. They were like, this is enough of a page turner to where there's plenty more space to use. And I keep getting that certainly from Knick fans, but I would say even from other people that there was more stuff. But no, there were some things I left out just because when I left stuff out, it wasn't because of space. It was because I don't have a clear way to introduce this to where it's tied to something that's really important. So a good example, I included half of the anecdote, but not the whole thing. Pat Riley, Bob Salmi, an assistant coach, and him finding a loaded gun in the weight room that Greg Anthony had left behind. So I do include that part in the book to describe Greg Anthony and how much of a contradiction he seemingly was. But so then the assistant coach, Bob Salmi, takes the loaded gun up to Pat Riley to kind of retrieve it and, say, Pat, one of our players left a gun in the weight room. So he takes it up to Pat, but Pat is up watching film in his office. And like some coaches, I don't know how many do, David, you might know, watches his film completely in the dark in his office. So he's bringing a loaded handgun up to Pat Riley, who's sitting in the dark room. So he walks in and he's got a gun at his side, and Pat Riley turns and looks at him and he thinks that that's the end, basically. So there was
you, this is why we got to train harder. We got to be ready for these moments.
Right. So there was that one. And then I think I'm going to have to run in a minute, but I'll give you one more. And this is the anecdote I so wish I could have used. So someone told me, a high-ranking person from the Knicks told me, the Knicks have a game. They've won 20-some games in a row at home. Richard Nixon wants to bring his grandson to a game at the Garden, so he does. The Knicks know he's going to be there, so they ask him in advance, can you come to the locker room, take pictures with the players, talk with our players? And it was so weird to me because I'm like, why are you so pressed to have Richard Nixon, of all people, speak to your players? Granted, I guess he's historic, but it's also historic for anyway. So right. So but they really want him to talk to players. So he agrees to that. But then the Knicks lose, for the first time in months at home. Richard Nixon's there anyway, comes in. Patrick Ewing is in his standard bucket of ice. And he gets up out of the bucket of ice and, the big ice packs on his knees to essentially apologize to the former president for having lost. They normally play better than that at home. And Richard Nixon, reaches way up and puts his hand on Patrick's shoulder. He says, Patrick, that's okay. In the future, though, if you can't beat him, just cheat. And I was blown away because I'm a, political science degree and, I'm a big history buff. And I'm just thinking I'm in my mind, I'm thinking about all the people we can market this book to that are not basketball fans, just that this is going to get Politico and everybody else is just going to have a field day with that portion of it. And that people that have an interest in politics, but not basketball, are going to, buy the book because of that. And I'm thinking about that. But within 5 or 10 minutes, I find that the game that Richard Nixon went to and when it's been written about in the media, and I'm like, he never said this because the Knicks won that game against Minnesota. The game Richard Nixon came to, they won the game by 25 points. I was so mad. And I confronted the person. I was like, did you actually see this happen? He was like, I could have sworn I read it somewhere in one of Pat Riley's books. I'm like, so really frustrating from that standpoint.
Not reliable. Yeah. Not reliable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nixon
so that was
Nixon doesn't think he cheated. He thinks that's a whole other story.
That's probably the other reason it never happened too. Right. Yeah, because Nixon would have never owned that. Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about the show ending on time because Judy, also known as Legal, will I don't even know what happens if we go to 12:01. I think we're all going to get shocked.
We've got another couple minutes. Go ahead.
Not a concern. But how does James Dolan fit in this story at all? What did you learn about him?
Yeah. Now that was a funny one because publishers that were interested in buying the book were asking me, how big a part of the book is he going to be? And I was like, I got to be honest. I'm not interested in making him a huge part of the book here because one, strategically, not because of that, but strategically, I was trying to end the book on as high a note as I could. This is a team that it's difficult probably to hold people's attention for 8 seasons where a team doesn't win a championship. So I wasn't interested in going through, I felt like ending the note on their finals run against the Spurs where they make it to the finals as an 8 seed was an appropriate place to bow out. Dolan had only really been involved with the team for maybe a year by that point, and it wasn't even a full year by then, but I showcased just enough of him to show how he gets involved, when he gets involved, what he's saying when he gets involved and kind of how off the wall it seems. That he basically, his first real true interaction with Jeff Van Gundy was essentially, if our players ever come off the bench like they did in that game against the Heat, in that playoff series against the Heat, I'm holding you accountable. It was like most people just say, hello, nice to meet you when they meet you. That's what James Dolan is essentially saying to Jeff Van Gundy. So, so I introduced
Nice
him
guy.
enough to kind of showcase that stuff, but I don't get into it much. I obviously get into the epilogue, what would happen later and kind of the beginning of the end, so to speak, from a couple people's vantage points about how Dolan was getting involved and how much more he was taking on once he became the owner and once he was the guy that, that wanted to be involved. And quite frankly, his first true move as the owner of the team, more or less, was to order the firing of Ernie Grunfeld with 8 games to go in their season. And then the team that had basically been 500 to that point won 6 out of the last 8 to make the playoffs. And then they made the finals. And a couple people told me, of course, that impacted the way Dolan thought, because in his mind, they went 6-2 because of the move he made to fire Ernie Grunfeld. That's the way he thinks. Right. And so it kind of put us on a horrible trajectory because we might have almost been better off if we'd lost.
We got to let you go, Chris. Congratulations. Yeah. This is the book. I promised you a heart out. Thank you, everybody. Get the book. Honestly, congratulations. Honestly, this is an incredible accomplishment. Get the book. All right.
Thank you.